Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I want to talk more about Thomas Edison. And let's just call this Edison has a lot more to say about music, about singers, about composers, about recordings. There's just so much information, and I've got tons and tons of pages here of notes in which I took and wrote over the years. And it's kind of fascinating because, Edison would document everything, and he insisted that his assistants should document as much as possible and also bring their books to him and he could review them. So they were very, very careful, to make sure that they wrote as much information as possible, except for anything secretive. Such with the diamond disc, there was a whole litany of names that they used for various parts of the disc, like birdies and butterflies and this, that, and everything else, which they never gave a definition for, at least in any great detail. And that's the stuff that they would look at when they would manufacture the records. And then they would sit there and make their notes and their messages to Edison saying, you have this, that, and everything else. And there was a lot of rejects, especially, and it's an interesting thing, right around 1921, 21 to like 23, let's just put it that way, there was an awful lot of rejects. And the interesting thing was that these records, were made of phenol plastics, condensite, which had been developed by Jonas Ellsworth many, many years earlier. And the interesting thing is that when they rejected the records, what they did, they threw them in the furnace. And all of that phenol plastic would go into the atmosphere. And it was an interesting thing. There were lots of complaints about animals dying and stuff like that in the neighboring areas. And they used to have lines of people bringing their dead dogs to get compensation from the Edison company. And it's interesting to note there's lots of other stuff that was going on with the recording industry at the time. I mean, they were making this stuff. And I remember talking to a fellow, his name was Gurdon Mayfield. He was a mail clerk at the Edison company. And the interesting thing about him was that he had to go to every building. And so he got to see everything that was going on. And he said there was one building you hated to go near, and that was the record-making building, because it stunk to high heaven. The smell of that phenol plastic was just so amazingly overpowering and so tremendously hot. And he would make his deliveries also to the old lab, and he would come to Edison's office, and if Edison was taking a nap, which was more so than not in the last years of his life, Edison's secretary, Meadowcroft, would meet Gurdon Mayfield at the door and say, Mr. Edison is working on a new invention. And of course, Gurdon Mayfield could hear Edison snoring, because Edison did snore. And it's just kind of interesting. And then he would just give the paperwork to Meadowcroft. Otherwise, he said he would just go right in and put it on Meadowcroft's desk. Another thing was that he said walking around, you'd always see lots of stuff going on. And he said Edison would come in a Model T. It was a guy named Johnny something, I don't remember his last name, who would drive. And Edison loved him because he chewed tobacco. So the two of them would sit there and chew and spit all the time as they rode. And then a limousine would come, and that would be Charles. And he used to say that Charles was very, very different. Charles was very impressed with Charles. And he was not like his father at all in many respects. Edison also was kind of fascinated by the fact of the popular music of the time. You had stuff called, okay, something fell. Okay. The interesting thing is that, there was music stores called Ditson's in New York, and they used to have counters set up, and people would be rushing in to buy the latest jazz pieces, which, I'm going to do a thing on Edison and jazz later. I'm not doing it yet. But I will just say the one thing that he did mention about jazz, that it sounds like dying animals in the backyard and it's for degenerates and nuts. And with that being said, I wanted to read a letter to you that was written to Edison by his assistant, C.B. Hayes. And it says, Mr. Edison, we are hounded by everybody for popular selections. All along the line comes the cry from dealers, jobbers, and buyers. Now, Mr. Edison, I know by experience that if you will sit down and listen to these songs, you would not accept any of them, as you are so prejudiced against this type of music. I will cite you an instance of this. Mr. Haynes sent a list of popular selections taken from the cylinder. You heard every one of the list at the house and did not accept one of them. It seems that the people have gone crazy over this kind of music, and if you would go to Ditson's on Saturday afternoon and watch the highbrows buying this music, you would be surprised. They had to put up a separate counter in the center of the floor. Therefore, Mr. Edison, I'm going to ask if you would let me select popular selections for the disc. I will keep the standard high and select only the best, and will arrange with Mr. Cronkite so that they will be well arranged and will make good records. I want to help you, Mr. Edison, in this, and feel confident that you will be pleased with the results. Respectfully, C.B. Hayes. Now, this is an interesting thing because this is the early days of popular music on the diamond disc. In fact, it's November 7th, 1913. It's right at the beginning. And we already see a trend. And at the bottom of the letter, Edison writes, Hayes, nothing goes on disc that I do not pass. If there is such a howl, select, say, 100, and I will go over again and select the least rotten, E. So you get this idea that, Edison has already become judge, jury, executioner for all intents and purposes when it came to the music. There's other things that Edison wrote about with music, and he not only picked the artists and the music, but he also felt that the tune was so very, very important. And people used to write him why the cylinders had the names of the singers on them, but why not the disc? Well, Edison, in his response to a letter asking about no names on operatic recordings on disc records, was as follows. And he said this to the secretary. He said, say the reason we do not give names of artists at the present time is there is so much faking, so many falsely acquired reputations, so many good grand opera singers who get reputations by reason of their fine acting, but have extremely poor voices. But the public, not discriminating, believes reputation is due to acting and not the voice, insists that we record these people without any voice. I myself have refused to be a party to this faking press agency work. I believe I now have the best voices and instrumentalists playing in the world. And when the public approves, I shall give the names. I have every grand opera singer with a good voice in both the U.S. and in Europe. Edison. Now, Edison had his 11 commandments with the diamond disc record, which I'm sure many people are very familiar with. And, first off, number one, we care nothing for the reputation of the artist, singer, or instrumentalist, except in a few rare instances where a person has established a unique and isolated position. Number two, all that we desire is that the voice shall be perfect as possible, free of conspicuous tremolo, clear without ragged sustained notes, free of subsidiary and false waves on these notes. Singers who can sustain their pitch as to be used in concerted work, who have sufficient overtones to produce mellow and not sharp mechanical tones. Singers whose volume changes are violent and ill-judged, so it makes it difficult to record, are not wanted. Third, when good voices are bound to an exclusive contract for 1 or 2 years, with an option to extend, pay a regular salary for a determined and known portion of their daily time, and taking into view their other engagements. 4, to discover these good voices, we can build up a body of good singers, bassos, baritones, tenors, and corresponding female voices, so we can have soloists for any time and any concert, any time for any part of an opera. Also, special voices for comic work. 5, to have a recording man who will travel the country, make trials of voices at singing schools, local opera houses, etc., and submit the voice to Edison for a while until the system is established to keep this hunt up constantly. 6, all tunes which are used on the phonograph except for local topical tunes which are fleeting are to be entered into the tune book. Each tune is to be rated as to its desirability from others used. 7, where artists are engaged to execute a definite number of pieces, they are to submit their repertoire, and we must judge as to the tunes we want. If we cannot find enough in their repertoire, then we submit our list of tunes to see if any of these can be executed by the artist. If not, we do not want him or her. 8, any new tune that is published, which is melodious and which seems to have merit enough and is of such a character that gives a promise of sustained popularity over a long period, should be sent to Granger and to be judged to see if worthy to be put in the tune book. And we go on. Number 9 here. No engagement of any kind is to be entered into with the artist whose voice has not been sent to Orange and judged. And here is number 10. I don't know what he was thinking. Number 10. It is not our intention to feature artists or sell the record by using the artist's name. We shall use no artist names, except in a few instances. We intend to rely entirely on the tune and the high quality of the voices, and not the names of the artists. And then there's 11, but that's just going on and on and on. Kind of amazing. The whole idea, someone who was so well immersed in understanding that identity sells. Edison had created a brand for himself. He wouldn't want to be introduced as an inventor. He would want to be introduced as Thomas Edison. But he didn't look at it that way with music. It's kind of an interesting and very bizarre thing. He also did a lot of work on recording and experimentation. Of course, with the 125-foot horn, he had that whole thing about how music got tangled up, and 125 feet was needed to untangle it. And that was built into the Columbia Street Studio. And the Columbia Street Studio was built quite a number of years before, and it was used initially for transcribing the diamond disc to cylinder, because late 1914, they went to transcribe cylinders. A lot of people called them dambarolas, And the thing that's interesting is that he tried this whole thing with different sized horns. Now, lots of companies did that to a degree. But Edison had a 22, 23, 25-foot horn, all the way up to like a 40, 42-foot horn, which fit inside the Columbia Street studio. But then he came up with the big daddy of them all, the 125-foot horn, which was constructed in the machine shop in the laboratory building. And that was connected, interestingly, to the Columbia Street studio, and that I had to cut an 8-foot swath out of the wall of the building, and then they stuck the horn in, and then they put a screen in front of it. And then they had to build a separate building to house the horn. Then they had to build another building for the recording studio. Now, their idea was that this would be somewhat hermetically sealed, so weather would not affect it. And really, weather had a profound effect upon acoustic recording, upon wax recording. I mean, the weather as it changed affected the wax, affected the recording heads, it affected everything. And so they felt that they could keep it constant in humidity and everything else, they would make good records. Well, there was lots of problems, and they set up a whole telephone system that ran in conjunction with the length of the horn. Therefore, they could keep in constant contact. Now, going through the notes of the 125-foot horn, I found there was lots of service calls going out to fix the telephone system. It constantly broke down. And so everybody resulted in basically just yelling back and forth across the horn, which totally took away any of the hermetic sealing of the recording studio. So it's an unfortunate thing. I mean, they tried really hard to work on that horn, but it had problems from the beginning. They put baffles in it. Edison even put storage batteries in it one time to see what would happen. Put ice in it, and then Will Hayes had to clean it out. That was his job. And another thing was with the horn, they found it was ridiculously directional. But when they could get that right direction, which was very difficult to do, and it would change daily. They had squares on the floor of the Columbia Street studio, and you would make your recording. And then you'd have to do it in various locations, and then, of course, Edison would judge. And they put mufflers on the back of pianos. And the interesting thing is the pianos that were used were Lauder pianos. Very important. The Lauder Piano Company was in Newark, New Jersey, and Edison used to always go to the Lauder Company to get new pianos because they had been pounded on, and so they had to be replaced. And then he would sit at the Lauder plant and pick out a piano. Now, his interesting way of picking out a piano was he'd take his finger and go ding, 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 each piano. And then doing that, he would pick the proper one. And then that would be brought to the studio and used until it was jazzed out. And then they would go get another one. I've often wondered, there was an awful lot of pianos being replaced. And I remember that in the notes, and it'd be an interesting thing to do, in the notebooks, there was the serial numbers for those pianos. It would be fascinating to find if maybe a lot of people unknowingly might have a Lauder piano that was in the Edison laboratory. Who knows? Another thing that's kind of interesting as well, at the same time, Theodore Edison was working on the Cinemusic system, which had lots of issues, lots of problems, and wasn't doing too well. But the thing is that the Cinemusic system was up to 16-inch a condensite disc, diamond disc, basically, that would do like 20 RPMs and stuff, and having a little trouble chugging. But he also developed a sound reproduction system. This was to provide music for the motion pictures. Came out just at the time that the Vitaphone system was coming out, and so it died. But Theodore had developed the horns for the system, which are very interesting. They still exist. And they were huge signet horns. And he was a doctor of mathematics. And so he would take the horns and mathematically figure how to enhance the bass response for these horns. And he put holes in the horns. And a lot of people look at the horn and say, why are there holes in it? Those are to enhance the bass response in the Cinemusic system, which sadly went nowhere. There's an awful lot I want to talk about here, and obviously I can only do so much right now, but a couple of things to mention, a couple of critiques. He listened to a fellow by the name of Max Bloch, tenor, from the Metropolitan Opera Company. Fair timber, not pleasin', might take a couple, but low price. Catherine Brown, contralto, rotten. This woman has no voice. Madame G. Champlain, soprano, no, no, no. Florence Crosby, contralto. It's too bad. Oh, I've done this one already. Never mind. So we'll skip that one. Seeger Ellis. Edison wrote down, stop kidding me. Florence Easton, soprano. Bad tremolo. Sharp. Variable volume and timbre. Not good, not wanted. William Beck, baritone. Holy Christ! Have you no memory? Are you a bunch of degenerates in New York? How many times have I asked you to have tests made with tunes we have, such as Evening Star for baritone? I'm getting damn sick of this. And then there was a Zalarina Bagatti, dramatic soprano. And he writes, she is certainly dramatic and has a good and powerful contralto like low and medium. Her high is a rapid tremolo and sharp. Think there are some opera tunes she would do fairly well if there was much music and accompaniment dramatic to drown out the sharp chatter. The voice is not extra, but think we can use. She's better than 9/10 of all the so-called grand opera sopranos that Tossi sent me from Italy. By the way, there's a thing about a lot of those recordings that were made in Italy. They had something, had room sound. And that was one thing Edison hated. In fact, he listened to a recording here. She was put too far away from the funnel to prevent blasting. This gives echo, room sounds, and makes it very hard to judge the voice. What should have been done is request she sings half volume and sing in rehearsal voice. Then she could come close to the funnel and not blast. And it would stop echoes and room sound. If you give them the hint to sing softly, as just if she was singing at home to her little daughter. I find that they are close to the funnel and sing. I find when they are close to the funnel and sing, it blasts. And it lets you hear and explain that we should tone down the stage volume and their strong high notes to half. Then do it right, and we get a good record, which you should have done. You would see that I could not judge her voice with all the echo. The woman has a fine interpretation, which is rare. And she also has little tremolo. Her timbre is good. Her high notes are poor. But I think it's the fault of the recording and interference of the echoes. We can probably use this artist. What was her name? Miss Herma Dolossi. Let's see, this is a violinist he listened to. Rudolph Bacchio. Not good, double stopping, third rater on this. He vibrates his fingers so much on some notes that it's the equivalent to a tremolo, which is very disagreeable. Please inform the pianist that I want to hear the violinist and not have the damn piano confuse me and play weak unless I need to hear it better. I should say he's a third rater. There was Miss Agnes Brennan, soprano. Rotten, not even to be considered. Let's go on a little further, because we're going to end this in just a few moments, because I am going through lots of stuff here, and there's just so much information to share. He listened to a lot of singers and had disparaging comments on them all. He also had a lot of comments on how music is played. You know, he hated certain instruments to be used the way they were. He felt the harp wouldn't record well, and so he drew pictures of how a harp should be placed in the recording studio. And it turned out the harp recorded better than almost anything, so they had to move it way, way, way back. Interesting stuff. So I wanted to share this little bit of information. I'm going to have a lot more of these as we go along. But Edison had some comments on singers, on concepts of recording, concepts of understanding music, singers, performers, the technology, so much going on. And he was in charge of it all, and nothing happened unless he said so. And nothing could be recorded unless he said so. And as you well know, he didn't want recordings that had room sound. He didn't want recordings that had brilliance. He wanted it in a certain way. And we understand something, that Edison had created the most incredible system for recording. But unfortunately, he did not allow a educated, more understanding individual to run it, monitor it, and to advance it. So that's all I have to say right now.